Okay. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Midtown Scholar Bookstore. My name is Alex. I'm with The Scholar. Thank you for joining us tonight. We're happy you're here, and we hope you enjoyed tonight's conversation with Dr. Allen Dieterich-Ward and Cindy Adams Dunn. As always, I have some quick housekeeping notes to go over before we get started. One, we have so many incredible events coming up in the next few months. Two that I'd like to highlight are Jazz Night on Friday, April 4th, and Independent Bookstore Day on Saturday, April 26th. They're both free and open to the public, and we'd love to see you there. For the latest event news, stay tuned to our social media, e-newsletter, and website, and please take an events postcard as you leave. Lastly, we encourage you to come away with a signed copy of Cradle of Conservation tonight. Allen will be sticking around afterwards for a book signing. We have books available for purchase up at the cafe. And a reminder that every purchase helps support our staff, the author, and our ability to continue running this event series to our community. At this time, it's my honor to introduce our speakers this evening. Our moderator this evening is Cindy Adams Dunn. Cindy is the Secretary of the Department of Conservation and Natural Resources, which manages 124 state parks and 2.2 million acres of state forest. She has helped position Pennsylvania as a leader in land conservation, outdoor recreation, green practices, and public land management. Under her direction, Pennsylvania continues efforts to address the impacts of climate change, as well as providing leadership on planning forest buffers along streams to improve water quality. Dunn has served in several leadership posts at leading environmental advocacy groups like Audubon, Pennsylvania, the Alliance for the Chesapeake Bay Foundation, and Penn Future. Of course, our featured author this evening is Dr. Allen Dieterich-Ward. Allen is a professor of history and director of the graduate school at Shippensburg University. His first book, Beyond Rust, Metropolitan Pittsburgh and the Fate of Industrial America, won the 2016 Arline Custer Memorial Award from the Mid-Atlantic Regional Archives Conference. He is the past president of the Pennsylvania Historical Association, former editor of the Pennsylvania History Series, and a board member of PA Humanities. Of course, Allen's new book that we are here for this evening is titled Cradle of Conservation, An Environmental History of Pennsylvania. I have to read just one blurb from none other than Cindy Adams Dunn, who writes, quote, Allen Dieterich-Ward brings to life Pennsylvania's environmental history, from the birth of the conservation movement in the 19th century to the impacts of climate change we're experiencing right now. This groundbreaking book is a crucial resource for anyone seeking to understand the people, places, and policies that have shaped and continue to shape life in the Keystone State and beyond, end quote. On that note, it's an honor to welcome Allen and Cindy to The Scholar this evening, so without further ado, please join me in giving them a warm Harrisburg welcome.
Well, this is great. Oh my gosh, all these people. Just a comment about all of you firsthand. I mean, there are people in this room who have made and are making environmental history in Pennsylvania right now, and who have made environmental history in Pennsylvania right now. So someday, on a stage like this, in the future, there'll be someone smart like Allen Dieterich-Ward talking about all of you and the work you've done, the work we've done together on conservation and environment. So environmental history is a continuum. Obviously, we've got a long way to go, and you're all part of that. So it's good to see so many people who are deeply engaged in the environment and conservation. And it's great to see this warm welcome for Allen Dieterich-Ward. I will point out, one of the things that allows us to have access to someone like Allen Dieterich-Ward is a state system higher education, where we have universities that employ people like Allen to write books like he's written, and to really
and graduate people like Cindy, I should say.
Just saying, oh yeah, I'm a ship person. But the point is that our university system is critical to the depth and breadth and learning that we have in Pennsylvania, and we offer that across our communities of Pennsylvania. So Allen, got a lot of questions for you. We want to move this along pretty quickly because we want to get to your questions too. We want to get to a healthy dialogue and hear your questions. Allen's a wealth of knowledge. We'll only get a small portion of it tonight. But just got to start with what inspired you to write this book?
Thank you, Cindy, and thank you to The Scholar for bringing all these folks together. I see old friends, I see new friends. Thank you all so very, very much for coming and spending some time with Cindy and me. So I'm from Ohio. I was actually born in West Virginia. That was the biggest city near where I grew up. And let me tell you, friends, when the biggest city near you is Wheeling, West Virginia, you are from the boondocks, right? And I grew up on a farm, and I moved here in 2006. People ask me why I moved here. I moved here because that's where the paycheck was. And the first thing I noticed about Pennsylvania are the public lands. I mean, this state, our ancestors, whether they're our birth ancestors, whether they're our acquired ancestors, have left us a legacy of public lands in Pennsylvania that I think many Pennsylvanians just don't understand how unique and important it is. I mean, I grew up in Ohio. Ohio is a lovely state, but it has nothing like the geography, the lands, the mountains that didn't just happen that way, right? But that were public policy choices. I can look out one of my windows down at Ship and see South Mountain, the Michaud State Forest. I can look out the window on the other side and see the Tuscarora State Forest. That's just a truly wonderful gift. And that is really what originally sparked my interest in figuring out how did that kind of natural bounty come to arrive. There were a lot of other steps in between there, but that's really what I think started the genesis of the book.
You know, it's funny you say that. That's what I love about Harrisburg in this area. Mm-hmm. It's kind of like the Navajo define their area by the mountains they can see from where they sit. And in this area, it's just like that. Yes. For the reasons you described, it's really super. Your book's really approachable, even for those of us not deeply immersed in environment or conservation. Why did you choose to write a book that's so approachable? It's full of facts. It's got a lot in it, but it's very readable, very approachable. It's not written from you got to be a historian, you got to be an environmentalist to read this book and get something from it.
So there are a couple of reasons for that. I mean, authors like to be read, and so writing books that people will read is the goal. The book series that this is in is published by the Pennsylvania Historical Association, and it's really designed with exactly that goal in mind. How do we go about making broad, interesting, deep, topics engaging for an audience? And I've been an editor of this series, and anyone who has written anything before knows it's a hell of a lot harder to write short than it is to write long. And I really wanted to get a book that would inspire, but that it could only inspire if people actually read it. And so it went through a number of different iterations. I had to leave so many things out. The first version of the book that I sent out to the reviewers, I had been so focused on kind of keeping it short that I got it back from the reviewers, and they noticed that I didn't say anything at all about the Pennsylvania Turnpike, which it doesn't need to be a whole chapter, but you do at least need to talk about the Pennsylvania Turnpike. And in trying to keep things short, I cut out this whole section that I didn't even remember, right? So the core, though, to the book and thinking of it is, how do you go about telling the story of a state that is so big and complicated? It's 3 or 4 states crammed into one. We don't want a story that's just about trees, right? Just because you pave over a forest, right, or you build a building in a field, that the environment doesn't go away. So it had to be a book that could talk about cities and suburbs and rural areas too, because that's where Pennsylvanians live. So ultimately, I sort of arrived at this concept of working landscapes, right? And I'm not the first person to come up with that at all. But that really made sense for talking about Pennsylvania. And if you will humor me for just 1 minute, close your eyes, right? Close your eyes. Mm-hmm. And think about the Pennsylvania landscape, right? What do you think of? You think of something, right? I mean, there's something in your mind that makes you think of Pennsylvania, right? There is and of course that place, whether it's hiking up on the Appalachian Trail, whether it's a Lancaster farm field, whether it's the nature in your backyard, whether it's, getting here on the highway, that landscape, that working landscape, right? If you dig into it, tells this wonderful story about the generations and generations that it took to get to what it looks like right now. And that notion of kind of literally or figuratively digging into what does Pennsylvania look like now, but how do we get to that place that it looked like now? That sort of became the way in which I approached telling the book and the story in the way I did.
It was a very gripping book. I mean, it's something that I went through fast the first time, and the second time I kind of remined it for a lot of gems, and it was just as rich the second time, even more so. You opened the book with a vivid description of Ralph Brock making his presentation to the very first Forest Commission in a building. Those of us in government work and those of us historians who care about the historical buildings know our state capitol really well. But imagining Ralph Brock making his presentation the very first
in that
Forest
room. I mean, the room is still there, right? Yeah.
Yeah. So talk about that. Talk about the significance of that, the moment, the Forest Commission, and Ralph Brock and him. Talk about that opening. I thought it was a gripping opening.
Thanks. Yeah. So as I sort of hinted at, in order to be able to tell this big, complicated story of a big, complicated state, I had to kind of look for these moments where there were themes and people that could encapsulate different stories all in one. And Ralph Brock is kind of one of the real keys to that. I mean, Ralph is the first trained black forester in the world. I mean, like the first, right? If you go down to Penn State Mont Alto today, he's been rediscovered, right, after 100 years. Ralph Brock's story is kind of inspirational. He was there with Myra Lloyd Dock. He was there with Gifford Pinchot and Joseph Roth. I mean, he was there, right? He was at that moment. And he was recognized as having given. Rothrock recognizes him as this prodigy, right, and sort of brings him with him to Mont Alto. He's named sort of student superintendent, really, of the first state nursery in the country. I mean, Pennsylvania has this notion that the government is going to be responsible for taking care of repopulating these devastated forest lands. I mean, Ralph Brock is the superintendent of that first nursery. But his story has that other side too. Mm-hmm. I mean, Ralph cannot escape his time, right? He is a man of color at a moment of progressive ideology. The same progressive movement that brings us conservation, that brings us city beautification, also brings us eugenics, also brings us segregation in the federal government, right? It's the same. You can't separate the two. And Ralph is essentially hounded out of his position by other young men who, in the parlance of the time, didn't fancy taking orders from a darky, right? And so he leaves Pennsylvania, but his story doesn't end. His story doesn't end there. He comes to the notice of John D. Rockefeller, of all people, right? Rockefeller sees his talent. He becomes the nurseryman for Rockefeller. And when Rockefeller is building Rockefeller Center, Radio City Music Hall in New York City, Ralph Brock is there. Ralph Brock is the landscaper for Radio City Music Hall under Rockefeller. He's there at the Paul Dunbar Apartments, the first real cooperative housing apartment complex for people of color. At the Harlem River, the first public housing for people of color in the United States of America, Ralph Brock is the nurseryman for that in New York City. So his story, right, is both transcendent, right, but also deeply typical. And those are the kinds of stories, those are the people, right? The people, the policies, the places that I really look for to be able to tell Pennsylvania's story.
It sounds like there's a book about Ralph Brock dying to be written today.
I think so too. Yeah. There is a lot that we just don't know about Ralph Brock. His descendants still live. I mean, it is there to be written. There have been some great articles, but even for myself, like, I don't know much about his young life. There's a story there waiting to be told for someone to pick up.
Yeah, and then thinking about who found Ralph Brock and helped him along. Myra Lloyd Dock. I mean, just right down the road here, Myra Lloyd Dock. And, the story of conservation and how Ralph Brock was brought into that. And you can walk on his nursery today in the Michaud. It's kind of an amazing story, and it's untold and it's not fully told, and it would be a great story to pull out. So anyway, moving on to Pennsylvania as both a microcosm in the environmental movement. I mean, big player in the environmental movement nationally, but also partly because of, as you well describe in the book, because of this tension of the Industrial Revolution and the carbon, the very carbon under our soils that led to the industrialization, that led to our really history of consumption and industrialism. So talk about that microcosm of both the movement and the tension in Pennsylvania.
So one of the academic-y things about this book that's there, right? It's there. But I sort of frame the book in that way of, why bother looking at Pennsylvania? And the academics have to answer that question, right? I mean, if you're writing a genealogy or a coffee table book or a town history, you're writing it because the people in the town care about that town, right? But for an academic, you have to give it, why does it matter, right? And for me, Pennsylvania is the microcosm of the nation, right? Much more so, and I kind of set it up compared to New York State, right? New York State and Pennsylvania have a lot in common, geographically, politically, the way it's settled, industrially, et cetera. But there are some things about Pennsylvania and Pennsylvania's history that make it incredibly important to the story of conservation and environmental history, but also make it a really good stand-in for the nation as a whole. And of course, I'll give two examples, right? One is that New York City, there is no New York City in Pennsylvania, right? And obviously that's true. But what I mean to say is that Philadelphia never achieves the dominance over the state of Pennsylvania that New York City does over New York State, right? And that has real big consequences all the way through to the politics of today, right? And a big reason for that is the environment, is literally the natural world. There is no break in the Appalachian Mountains, the Alleghenies, right? In Pennsylvania, like the Mohawk River break in New York. That allows for the Erie Canal to be built. That allows for all of the wheat and all of the commodities of all of the Great Plains to be channeled through Chicago and then through Buffalo and through New York City, and New York City becomes that. Pennsylvania doesn't have that, right? Geographically, we are dispersed. Philadelphia is powerful, but not nearly that powerful. Pittsburgh has its own identity. It's separate. I mean, our watersheds, the great big watershed in Pennsylvania, the Susquehanna, doesn't flow to a Pennsylvania city, right? And so in order to get anything done in Pennsylvania, you have to make the kinds of political, cultural, moral compromises that New York City can just jam down people's throat in New York State, right? I mean, I'm kidding, but it's also true, right? And so what that means then is that the kinds of conservation that emerges in Pennsylvania looks different from the kinds of conservation that emerges in New York State, right? In New York State, you have the Adirondacks, you have the Catskills. Both of those big natural areas are designed with one thing in mind: serve the needs of New Yorkers, right? Keep their water pure, keep the Erie Canal open. The state forests in Pennsylvania aren't designed that way. They're much more geographically diverse and disparate and spread out. They're designed to serve the state much more as a whole than the earliest state forests were in New York State, right? If you have to compromise, that is very frustrating in your politics, right? But as a nation as a whole today, the coast can't cram things down folks' throat. We know that, right? And so in Pennsylvania, where you have to find those compromises, where you have to figure out a way for policies that conserve that greater mass, my sense is that makes Pennsylvania a really important place to study throughout its history, getting us to where we are today. So,
that's a really...
And I didn't even mention coal, oil, and natural gas.
Right, right. That is so true. In DCNR, we have the Geologic Survey, and we always say it all begins with geology. You make that point so well. I mean, you have to think about why we are the way we are as a state, and it really begins with geology. It's interesting to put it that way. And that's why, like, if you've been involved with our conservation landscapes, and especially the South Mountain landscape, and working landscapes. And you mentioned Adirondacks, place I love to go. My husband and I love to go on vacation, and it's cool. It's remote. It's all that.
And just before you get to your question, that is one thing that New York and Pennsylvania shared in mind. The real movers and shakers in the origins of the Pennsylvania Forestry Association. These, remember, you think Pennsylvania Forestry Association. What do you think of? You think of rugged, outdoorsy, rural men, right? The two most important people in founding the Pennsylvania Forestry Association, their names are Maria Cox and Mary Lundy. They are two Philadelphia socialites. One is married into the biggest coal company, the biggest name in coal of the early 19th century. If you have ever been to Eckley Miners Village, Maria Cox's brother-in-law, Eckley Cox, named after him, right? Mary Lundy, her husband was an Episcopal minister, one of the first prison chaplains in Sing Sing, an abolitionist. Both of their families vacationed in the Adirondacks, and that is really where the strain of wilderness as spirituality really comes from Mary Lundy. The framework of sort of conservation utilitarianism comes from the Cox family. Those two folks, we talk with no offense to Joseph Rothrock. Joseph Rothrock would have been an academic speaker that people have forgotten everything about if those two Pennsylvania socialites hadn't come together and pulled the men into the room and got the Forestry Association started.
Let's stay on that a little bit. It's Women's History Month. It's March. Are
we allowed to say that still?
Some of us go into the Rachel Carson State Office building every day. Some of us walk past Myra Lloyd Dock's house. Some of us talk about the history she really started. Yeah. And then there's the civic movement for the environment and the governmental movement for the environment and the interrelationship of both of them. So expand on women, the civic movement, and government, and
sure.
Men and the business, and Horace McFarland and the business community. Just
sure.
Stay on that point a little while.
Obviously, I can't get through this talk. I would be tarred, feather, and run out of town on a rail if I didn't hold up Myra Lloyd Dock in this conversation. Myra Lloyd Dock. Have you guys all seen the documentary that the Conservation Heritage Project put together on Myra Lloyd Dock? That, and I think Linda, you were in that documentary, right? You were the voice. She was the literal voice right here. That documentary, I came out, I watched it right up here at the State Museum. I left crying. It is such a moving piece. That documentary moved the folks in DCNR so much that people looked around and said, why don't we have anything named after Myra Lloyd Dock, right? And we put together a movement for the old Penn Nursery is now, of course, the Myra Lloyd Dock Conservation Center. She is that important. I don't want to spend too much time because I know that many folks know about her. There's a fantastic book by my former colleague Susan Rimby on Myra Lloyd Dock. Here's the one thing I will say about her. As I noted at the beginning of this talk, it was really, really, really important for me to make sure that there was a lot of urban environmental history in this book, right? And there are a couple of reasons for that we'll get into maybe later in the chat. But Myra Lloyd Dock personified that, right? She lived in Harrisburg. Her passion were the youth of Harrisburg that she felt were kind of being stifled in this unhealthy, disgusting environment. She kind of gets herself an education, you know what I mean? Becomes the most sought after public speaker in the state of Pennsylvania, all after she's 40, right? Launches this movement for city beautification in Harrisburg. So much of what we love about Harrisburg, the Susquehanna Riverfront, Wildwood, the Greenbelt, all of those things are owed to Myra Lloyd Dock. And then on top of that, she becomes the first woman in any state public office. She becomes the first woman on a forestry commission anywhere in the world. She ties together this urban and rural landscape of that progressive era, and she does it, as Cindy noted, through her connections of the women's movement, the Civic Club movement, the Garden Club movement. if you take a look at Myra Lloyd Dock's correspondence, and Mary Lundy's correspondence, they are talking with women all throughout the state in these civics clubs. You can look in Carlisle, you can look in Westchester, you can look out in Pittsburgh. All of these women have launched this movement to clean up the mess that men made. I'm kidding, but it's true. To clean up this mess, right? It's this fantastic story that is not just an urban story or not just a political story, but an environmental story. I mean, this is the story of conservation in Pennsylvania, the story of women in all of these civic clubs improving their communities.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, I love Rimby's book as well, and the Conservation Heritage Project. I got to say, if you don't know that, Google it, you'll find it. Pennsylvania Park and Forest Foundation holds a web page. It was Brenda Barrett's brainchild when she was at DCNR, and she'd come into us from the historical side of things for the National Park Service. Anyway, it's a great resource, and we keep adding to it. And we need to keep adding to it as we keep making history. So I want to explore a little bit the conservation movement, Franklin Curry, the Environmental Rights Amendment, Laudatio, and the whole Federation of Sportsmen's Club conservation movement led to the constitutional amendment. And then the transition to the regulatory environmental movement coming out of the Cuyahoga, coming out of national environmental disasters that led to the regulatory era of air, water, pollution control, and the environmental strike force at DR, which is now DEP.
I think you just summarized 3 chapters, Cindy.
Yeah, I know. I did. I know. But what I'm learning about interviewing you is you get a lot with a little. So I'm going for a big question. I'm going for the big question, so you can just run with it for 3 chapters.
Okay.
And I can drink. And I can drink water. No, I talk about the conservation movement, environmental rights amendment,
Sure. Yeah.
Sportsman Club transitioning to the regulatory era,
Sure.
transitioning to Pennsylvania state government with a regulatory role.
Yes.
And then some of the bifurcation of the movement from, conservationists, environmentalists, and some of that.
Yes. Okay. So I'll take off a couple pieces of that, and we'll go from there. So if I couldn't get out of this room without being tarred and feathered, without talking about Myra Lloyd Dock, I would be an even bigger disappointment to someone I do not want to disappoint, and that is Brenda Barrett, by not talking about Maurice Goddard. If Joseph Rothrock was the father of Pennsylvania forests, Maurice Goddard, this very long-serving Secretary of Forests and Waters and the Department of Environmental Resources, a dear friend and a mentor to, I know, many of the people in this room. Goddard's legacy we all see and enjoy every single day. He did not create the first state park in Pennsylvania, but he dramatically expanded the state park system in just the same way that Rothrock and Dock recognized the need for state forests. And if we think about the ways in which working landscapes sort of create a need for certain kinds of public policy interventions, well, the public policy intervention of conservation was, of course, for the polluted, disgusting urban environment, the clear-cut trees. The public policy intervention that state parks were around was the need for healthy, wholesome environments for recreation, right? For young people, places where folks who no longer were oftentimes working directly with natural resources, but needed to rediscover, to engage with, to enjoy those resources in a way that was made possible by the economic boom following World War II. And so, Goddard, who does many, many things, this notion that it's not just about forests for production, but also nature for enjoyment and for consumption, that piece of the Pennsylvania story that we all love and enjoy comes down to that vision of of Maurice Goddard. But I should say, of course, just like with Myra Lloyd Dock or with Joseph Rothrock, those are just individual people. The only reason we have those state parks is because people voted to spend their tax money on those state parks. And that was not a given. That was not a given. The bond issues that were required to buy these state parks were not always extremely popular among everyone in the state. Goddard crisscrossed the state, drumming up support. A lot of folks in rural areas were like, why do I need to spend money on that? I have plenty of access to, to the outdoors, right? But what happens here, just like we see in the conservation era, is a set of public officials and their supporters who identify the needs of a broad swath of the Pennsylvania public and put together a coalition to get the public policies passed to meet those needs, right? The Project 70 bond issue passes. Folks understand how important these new state parks are. They enjoy these new state parks. And kind of from that moment on, the usage of Pennsylvania state parks has grown and grown and grown and grown and grown, right? And so when we think about, I think, this relationship between people, places, and these public policies, that's where I think it's really useful for us to look at the past, right? To look at these eras of Pennsylvania history to see what were the problems and the concerns and what were the strategies, right, that folks like Rothrock and Doc and folks like Gifford Pinchot, Pinchot too, but folks like Maurice Goddard, right, used in order to be able to bring people together who had very widely different ways of looking at the world. If you think political polarization is not new, right? Different ways of looking at the world is not new. And yet, by identifying where those intersections are, good things can get done, and we're the beneficiaries of them today.
Well, and that pattern is very much alive today. I mean, Governor Shapiro's pitched one new state park and a big enhancement and addition of another state park today, and in fact, stumping for the funding and the coalition to do that today. With the backdrop of environmental and conservation being dismantled at the federal level, like daily, the dismantling of President Carter's Council on Environmental Quality, the dismantlement of NEPA, defunding of key federal agencies, and yet in Pennsylvania, a fairly strong appetite to expand on outdoor opportunity, on environmental protection, on clean water. This juxtaposition of interests that it really come to an epicenter in Pennsylvania. I mean, Pennsylvania's in the crosshairs of this to this day.
Well, again, we haven't. This isn't the first time. I mean, politics evolves, the pendulum swings, right? To give another example, I mean, if we look at the 1980s, the 1980s are a similar moment when you have this huge increase, this huge investment in public parks in Pennsylvania in the 60s and 70s. That stops in the 1980s, right? I mean, I think there are there are only a handful of state parks that are created kind of after 1980. The broader mood shifts on the national level. The industrial base that had fueled Pennsylvania's prosperity collapses, right? And there is a reshuffling of political administrations. There's a reshuffling of values. And though, environmental policymaking doesn't just stop, right? It doesn't. We see a new type of policymaking, a new type of coalition building. Things like farmland preservation, right? Things like rails to trails, which I'm very partial. I mean, rails to trails are public-private partnerships, right? Public and private investment. And as I remind folks, rails to trails are semi-reclaimed brownfields, right? Don't dig out on a rail trail. You will not like the stuff that's in the soil there. I mean, these are, how do we go about looking at the working landscapes of the past that no longer meet the needs of today and think about the ways in which we can come together with good public policies to reinvent those working landscapes for the needs of tomorrow, right? Rails to trails, another example of that, of course, Pennsylvania. If we think of Pennsylvania as being the leader in the conservation era, it is most definitely the leader in the environmental era, right? And then it becomes the leader in this kind of post-industrial era as well, what I think of as this kind of emerging social justice kind of paradigm of Pennsylvania, how to go about looking to those folks who have not always enjoyed the environmental amenities of these previous eras. Our brownfields reclamation laws, the land recycling programs of Pennsylvania. Ohio, again, where I'm from, is 20 years behind in its, there's plenty of brownfields in Cleveland and in Akron and in Youngstown, in Toledo, but Ohio is at least 20 years behind where Pennsylvania is in figuring out what kinds of public policies are necessary for doing brownfields renewal. So we see this another stage where by figuring out kind of that Venn diagram of where do these different constituencies have overlaps where we can get good things done, Pennsylvania is able to do that again really in the 1990s and leading into the 2000s.
I got the 5-minute signal, so I am going to ask a mega question that rolls a lot into it. So your last book, or at least the last book I read, Beyond Rust, focused on Pittsburgh. And in this book, you talk about Tom Murphy, mayor of Pittsburgh, friend of Mike Walsh is here, and in his vision for Pittsburgh, you know, the industrial epicenter of the eastern part of the nation, and certainly in Pennsylvania, and coming out of the ashes of the post-industrial era with the steel mills closing and big changes in Pittsburgh, he envisions this rail trail system and the revitalization of the rivers, and really spawns a movement that Pennsylvania now leads the nation in a number of named rail trails, and we close trail gaps and build rail trails.
I mean, remember,
right
while he was still a state representative, Tom Murphy was the lead on the Pine Creek Gorge bill that created rails to trails in Pennsylvania.
Which was really a precedent center in our mission area in DCNR with the first big forestry run trail. But looking at the recreation and the revitalization, overlaying climate and climate change, and the need to really reduce carbon, and the need to build a consensus position to tackle these big issues in a state that's the epicenter of, you know, gas. I mean, a big producer, the biggest in the nation, and yet with the biggest opportunity with outdoor recreation and trails and rail trails and rivers and mountains and parks. How do you see this? How do you see Pennsylvania wrestling with all of this and remaining, positioning ourselves in a leadership role and kind of showing the way for a divided nation?
Yeah, time's up, right? No,
Sorry, I know it's like a 5-hour question. I know. I had to figure out how to get that all in there with the remaining time.
I'm struggling with this. I have some ideas. They're not fully formed, and B, they're not fully satisfying. But I guess that's the times we live in, right? That's why I'm a historian. I'm much better. It's much easier to make judgments on things 100 years ago than today, right? So a couple of things. My sense is that the conservation landscape initiatives that Brenda Barrett and DCNR have launched, you know, it's been more than 10 years ago, 15 years ago now, right? Yeah. That can lead the way in helping people to figure out what it is that they love about their local areas, their regions, and to be able to come together from different backgrounds to mobilize on the basis of those regions. I really do think that is one piece, and I talk about this at the end of the book about sort of the rediscovery of local communities in COVID. And in my community, folks that, you know, again, I know have very different big picture political views than I do, but that love the same landscape that I do, that we can come together to work on. My sense is that's really the starting, that has to be the starting point, because the more abstract you get with environmental problems, the more difficult it is to create meaningful mobilization of constituencies. I mean, that just is the case. I mean, when you're asking people to sacrifice economic good for an abstract problem that they don't necessarily feel that they can do anything about, that's a really, really difficult sell for people. It just is. So my sense is the starting point is mobilizing around local and regional issues, finding consensus on what is best in that regard, and then building out from there, building that trust. Many of the issues that we are most concerned with, of course, about global warming are and will increasingly manifest in terms of those local issues. Right. I know, for example, clean water. A friend of mine and former colleague, I was on an email exchange with a local township supervisor who sort of blasted her for being worried about big issues like global warming when she should really be focused on local water resources, you know, and of course those two things are the same. And so I think mobilizing in those terms of the most concrete ways that we can find common ground. That is not particularly satisfying, I know, but it's the best starting point.
I think it's true. I think it's true. People agree on place. They love a place. I think it's absolutely, you're right on. They love the same mountain. They love the same
I don't see any way forward without that as the
No, I agree. Okay, so I think now we're switching to a different format.
First, can we give just a quick round of applause for Alan and Cindy? We're going to transition to audience Q&A at the moment. We have a microphone up on the balcony, so balcony people, if you have a question, Amanda's your person. I have a mic down here. I'm just going to go through the room. We'll start over here, and then we'll make our way over there. So if you have a question, just raise your hand, and I'll come around with the mic. Anyone?
And Cindy has a lot more expertise with dodging questions that she doesn't want to answer.
I'm good at that. No. just through my budget hearing. I'm good. I'm ready.
Hey, very interesting talk. The one part that really caught my attention was the brief description that you made about how forests can be cut to prioritize different things. And I think it was a bit on the New York State prioritizing their watersheds to keep things clear, to keep canals flooding. That type of practical approach to like natural resource utilization, do we have an example of something in Pennsylvania that occurs to you that would be a very more of a pragmatic approach to a policy solution like, canal traffic?
Do you want to answer? I mean,
you start with what you have, and
sure.
I'll gather my thoughts.
Sure. Do you want to answer? No, you really want to answer that. Let's see. Well, I guess to blow that up into the big picture, I was actually just having this conversation earlier today. Pennsylvania's conservation movement was always about the greatest good for the greatest number for the longest time, right? I mean, that's kind of that standard. And we can problematize that a little bit if we want to talk about that a little bit more. But the great battle of the conservation movement, sort of nationally, that if you take an environmental history class, I promise you'll have a whole lecture on this, is this big battle between Gifford Pinchot and John Muir on preservation versus conservation, right? The sort of, you may know that battle. Here in Pennsylvania, it was very clear to everyone that there were no pristine lands, right? That all lands in the state had always been used for economic value, whether it was by native peoples, whether it was by colonists, whether it was by industrialists, whatever, right? And so the conservation movement, while there were these there were these spiritual elements to it, right? The underscore was always that these are lands that are going to be enjoyed, yes, but that they're always going to be used, right? And so all of our state forests, right, are designed with multiple uses, but they are designed to run a timber industry, to manage a timber industry, to support economic wealth generation, right? And I think that's a really useful place to start, because it allows for that kind of very notion from the beginning that these are lands that are first and foremost, that are always a balance between conservation, between sediment control, between making sure that that you don't have wildfires, et cetera, but that are always designed also for human good, right, for economic development. That framework is a really good starting point, I think, for all of the conversations about Pennsylvania's conservation and environmental history, all the way through today. That's a given, right? And so that's actually different than New York State, right? In New York State, the Adirondacks are set out. I mean, these are preserves. I mean, like, they are set out to be preserved, and so that difference between those two, even though in practice it doesn't always happen in a particular way, does distinguish, I think, Pennsylvania's conservation from the conservation that we see in New York or that we see elsewhere, in a way that helps to begin the coalition building. If you start with that as a starting point, then that allows for the kinds of coalition that you're not going to build if something is seen as kind of, it needs to stay like this or can only be used for one thing. That was a bit general. I apologize, but hopefully that helped to provide a framework.
Great,
First of all, the two of you have done Shippensburg very proud.
One of our trustees.
Two quick comments, and at some point you may want to put in a plug for the sustainability program at Shippensburg.
Absolutely.
Second of all is that there's another kind of conservation that Pennsylvania is a leader in that we should be very proud of, and that is the preservation of Gettysburg Battlefield.
That's right. Yep.
You know, all the property that's been acquired over the
And I
last
should
10
say
years.
that if any of you in here know Dave Mayer, who is the he's DCNR's, because DCNR manages heritage areas in the state of Pennsylvania, right? And he's their national areas. He made sure, before this book was published, that he made damn sure that exact point was in there. And so I literally photocopied him a page proof of my page talking about that and sent it to him so that he could be assured that cultural resources are in there too. But you're absolutely right, an absolute leader in cultural resource conservation.
Okay, here's my question for you. A generation ago, if people had heard of Gifford Pinchot, it was largely because of his second act. You know, pulling the farmers out of the mud, the Pinchot roads, that's what they knew about. You know, obviously there's been a lot of research and scholarship done since then.
Yep. Char Miller has a great biography of Pinchot.
But all the people, places, events that are in your book, the students coming in from high school, do they know any of this?
No, because and I didn't. Particularly about Gifford Pinchot. And it's funny. There were two things. I only gave you one of the two things that I noticed when I came to Pennsylvania. One of them was all the great public lands. The other was that every podunk little tiny township road going from nowhere to nowhere is paved. In Ohio, like it's the only roads that aren't paved in Pennsylvania apparently are forest roads. And I noticed that growing up in the country in Ohio, there were plenty of dirt roads, and they're all paved in Pennsylvania, and I came to find out that is exactly because of Pinchot getting the farmers out of the mud during his second term as governor. Of course, the fact that I can only now get a beer at Sheets is also due to Pinchot too. So I guess you take the crunchy with the smooth, right?
We have a question up here on the balcony.
Hi. My friend here and I are teachers. We teach U.S. history, so we touch about things like, you know, Levittown.
Thank you.
Levittown and but thank you for that. But we talk about things like Levittown, and we do briefly mention, you know, because there's only so much time, you know, as you know.
I do.
Rachel Carson and Sinking Spring, and we briefly touch upon things like the environmental movements of, you know, surrounding the time with Sinking Spring. So what do you think if a history teacher has just a little bit of time to kind of talk about that era?
The environmental era, like the 60s and 70s or whatever?
Yeah, that. Like, you know, obviously we could talk about it for a long time, all those issues. But if like that specific era, if you think that a teacher could talk about anything, like what do you think students should, like young high schoolers, what do you think they should really hit home? What do you think the teacher should really make sure they understand for the next generation of people who could possibly have their own movements?
Great. I would start with the mining company that blew the hole in the bottom of the Susquehanna River. That catches everyone's attention, right? Which then led to a massive acid mine drainage down the Susquehanna River, which led to a nobody lawyer from Sunbury named Franklin Curry running a Clean Streams and Clean Politics campaign, which led to a partnership between Curry and a Westinghouse electrical engineer who liked to go up to his hunting cabin with his buddies, who became state representatives and led a revolution that really changed the face of Pennsylvania and set a standard for the nation as a whole. That then, of course, led to the Pennsylvania Environmental Rights Amendment, which I really want to underscore for your students, makes Pennsylvania unique. Again, comparing us to New York State. New York State has a conservation rights amendment, but it does not lay out the guardianship and the vision of the state as the protector and guarantor of those natural, scenic, and historical and aesthetic values. And then underscore the fact, this kind of taking that forward, underscore the fact that that constitutional amendment is sort of forgotten about for 30 years, but then it comes back again just recently, and that every single one of those students have those same rights, that right to clean air, that right to a healthy environment, and that I think is going to be the foundation for that next generation. That notion of environmental rights is going to be that foundation for that next generation, I think, of activism. Yep.
Yeah, absolutely.
I actually worked for Senator Curry late in his career. And reading through your book, remembering some of those early votes, you know, the Clean Streams Act actually passed unanimously in the first iteration and then passed overwhelmingly in the conference committee report. Even the Environmental Bill of Rights passed overwhelmingly. The chances of either...
Unanimously. The Environmental Rights Bill passed unanimously twice.
Yes.
Right.
And the chances of that happening in this legislature are zero.
Somewhat diminished, yes.
Yeah. So I guess my question is for both of you. What advice would you give to people in the political field to start framing these questions in such a way that somebody running for office like Franklin Curry can run and be elected on environmental issues? Any advice as to how to start to frame these issues so we could at least get back into the ballgame?
Yes. So again,
Going back to place.
I've been trying to think through these things too. Number one, not to reiterate, but just that notion of thinking about place. Virtually every, regardless of your political background, right, or your political inclinations, virtually no politician is going to run on dirty air and dirty water, right? And so like that is a non-starter. It seems to be it's the abstract nature of some of many of our environmental problems that seems to be the place where things are hung up, right? So first of all, concrete in place. The second is, and this is something that I had a great meeting this afternoon with some folks kind of just thinking about what comes next. There has to be, I think it is clear that there has to be regulatory reform. And I think that those on the, I think that those who call themselves environmentalists, like that side of the spectrum, have to figure out what environmental regulatory reform might look like in a way that is productive, that is going to get the vision of environmental cleanup that we want, but that does not play into the hands of those who blame environmental regulations for economic decline. I think that looking at the trajectories of those who call themselves environmentalists in both of the major political parties since the 1970s, that undercurrent of environmental regulations kill jobs, whether that is true or not, and in what situation it is true or not, that has such a powerful resonance that unless environmentalists figure out a way to critique and criticize existing regulations and posit something new, I don't see how you're going to be able to have the kind of groundswell of political support that's going to be necessary for the next generation of environmentalism. I've been thinking through that, and that's where I am at this point. I just, looking at the attacks on the bureaucracy and the regulatory state, I don't think an outright defense of doing things the way that, just continuing on in the way that things they are, I don't think that that's a viable political strategy at the moment.
And I don't disagree with that at all. And I think in addition, we have to get into the human dimension and really in the fields of psychology and sociology and understanding what motivates people. And I think that continuum of education and action, I think sometimes you lead with action, even simple action, simpler actions like making your neighborhood greener and planting trees and beautifying your neighborhood, the thing you care about, together with your neighbors. And then from there, understanding clean air, climate change through a cooler temperature on your streets. Action can generate engagement and understanding, and engagement and understanding can generate action, but it's a cycle. And we always, I think in the past, we looked at it like, oh, you have to be aware and you have to be educated, and then the continuum goes up to action. I think action can come first, and I think just simple actions can lead to a greater understanding, can lead to bigger actions.
I mean, that myself, in my private life, I'm on our local rail trail council, and I focus on building rail trails. I focus on the heritage side of that too, but it's really about, I see the rail trail movement in reconnecting communities, getting people together in a single space so that they can love that space together. Yeah. That action, to me, looking around at the people that I interact with on an everyday basis, who again come from very different political backgrounds, that has been the key to any success that I've had on a local level, is getting that action first and worrying about other things later.
And we need a bigger tent. I mean, this is a white room. We need to engage communities of color. We need to engage people where they are, the things they care about on our street, in our neighborhood. We need to have a bigger tent with sportsmen. We have to have a bigger tent with people who identify as being interested in industry and energy. We have to have a bigger tent, an educational community, and show the self-interest and find a way of engagement of people more where they are, and lead with some action, and then lead to some understanding, and then a common understanding of place. And I think that's one set of steps that can get us at least partway down that road. We have to have a strong governmental framework there as well. And the threats to governmental framework at the federal level are really concerning. Not just the funding, but just that backstop that creates the level playing field, that allows industry to perform better, because there's this framework of equitability across the economic spectrum too. There has to be a level playing field there too. So you really have to have grassroots all the way up to the top levels of government functioning. So I think people speaking up about the highest level of government action, and also being involved at the grassroots level in a very broad and inclusive way.
Okay, this next one will be up here, slightly to your left.
Hi, I'm the chair of biological sciences at Messiah University, and we've met Cindy a long time ago at Gifford Pinchot, but it's good to see you again, and I really appreciate your conversation tonight. Full disclosure, I've not read this. However,
but you'll be assigning it next fall, right?
It is. I want your signature, and I want to be reading this in May. History is really important, and when I am teaching a class on environmental issues years ago, students were just leaving that class depressed. We added and sustainable solutions, because students want to be a part of the solutions for today. You describe, I think, very aptly where we need to be in the future. But between the past and the future, we're here in the present. I am very curious what hope we can give for our students now. Not hope for just like what's coming down 10 years from now. We are here, we are mired, we're watching it dismantled in front of our eyes, and we want to protect what we've had. We have this rich history. We want to bolster what we have, protect it from being lost to the next take from industry. Like you said, you have a great history here of us reclaiming what industry has already kind of destroyed. That's a good history in part. I mean, there's a reconciliation and a restoration there. That's great.
Could be worse, right?
But it could be worse. That's right. How do we keep it from getting worse now? I'm asking this question on behalf of my students that are asking me this nearly every day.
Sure. Well, as a historian, I can say every generation thinks that it's never been as bad as it is now, right? And maybe that's true, right? But I was only 2 years old when Ronald Reagan was elected, and James Watt and Ann Buford Gorsuch were playing much the same roles that certain, that folks in the federal administration are right now. And I think there was a backlash to that. I mean, like the dismantling of the Department of Interior and the National Park Service, the dismantling of EPA, the pendulum swung back, And so I would say to those students, yes, there are challenges for you to take up in the future, right? But for right now, we've been here before. In the 80s, they were staring down the threat of nuclear disaster. They were staring down, concerns about dismantling the federal government. There was a pendulum shift, and some of our great environmental policies came out of that. We're in a federal system, and no executive order can take that away. And so my sense is that for a variety of reasons, we are focusing too much on the federal government, frankly. And I think that some of the arguments about the federal government being too powerful apply to situations like this, right? I think that that's another lesson on focusing on your local community, focusing on your region, and focusing on your state do not mean that you are burying your head in the sand about the federal level. It means that you are taking action where and how you can, meaningful action where and how you can. And for those students, I would probably tell them, stop focusing so much on your social media feeds that are driven by the fear at the federal level, and focus on what you can do in your local community, in your local region, and on the state level. That's where you can make that difference right now. I would imagine the state secretary here probably agrees.
No, I mean, we got a good governor supporting a clean environment and supporting a cadre of workers who are doing the stewardship work of that was given to us through the Environmental Rights Amendment. So got that.
Yes.
Local governments, really important. A lot of land use decisions are made at the local level. The concept of sustainability is out there. It's a common thread from all walks of life. I think people understand sustainability and don't see it as a divisive issue. So I think you've got that to work with. The greatest good for the greatest number in the long run. So you have a lot of positive things they can focus on, but never forget they have a voice, and they can use that voice to write and mobilize. Find community. One person's one voice, but find like-minded people and work together. And people listen to students. I mean, students can get into offices that I can't get into. To be honest, what legislator is going to turn down a visit by some students who have something to present or something to discuss? They have a bigger voice than they realize. The Earth Day is coming up. April's coming up on us. Earth Day movement. Never forget that was students that generated the first Earth Day and became really a tip of the sword for the environmental movement. So don't ever. Young people should never underestimate their power.
Afterwards, I would love to get names of those offices. I'll get my students.
Oh, that sounds like a wonderful opportunity.
So we are just about over time, so we have time for just one last question.
I have been very curious on this topic for a little while, but from a conservational standpoint, do you guys have any perspectives or opinions on the reintroduction of large predatory species, including in the area of Pennsylvania, because we have a largely extant number of beneficial species, and in the cases of Yellowstone, where we've seen the wolves reintroduced, that is an extremely large, expansive area where they've played a huge role in shaping the landscape and bringing back a lot of other extant species, whereas in Pennsylvania, we have smaller and more spread out federal lands. So how do you feel they could play a part versus urbanization in the cities that could be found in this area if larger predators were to be reintroduced, or if it is even a good idea to consider them in our conservational areas?
I have not given that issue any thought particularly. Just beyond, wouldn't it be interesting if there was a panther here, right? So I can't speak to that. I will say, and this is one of those areas where this is not addressing your question at all, but just in your thankfully, thank you for nodding at me and being patient. I'm getting old, Cindy. So times have changed. When I was a kid, there were no foxes. There were no bobcats. I distinctly, and I grew up on a farm in Southern Ohio. One of the things that I should note to folks who are young, who it is just not, it's barely even noticeable to have a bald eagle fly over again. That's new. I mean, that is something that is new and exciting and commonplace now. So I guess what I would say is the notion that larger predators might someday be introduced it is no more far-fetched than thinking that I was going to just hardly even look up when a bald eagle flew over anymore. And so there are obviously lots of consequences and issues involved with that, but there's no reason not to dream of having that happen someday. I mean, that's the way I would put it.
Just adding that a little bit. I mean, I think that we as humans really co-evolve with animals, and I think we have this need to understand and be connected to the wild. One thing to think about, I'm not sure Pennsylvania is ready for the reintroduction of wolves and mountain lions.
I'm pretty sure that we are not.
Yeah, because...
I mean, I'm just saying, I don't think we're ready for that, right?
However, the coyotes are kind of ready. We are missing a top-level predator. One of our biggest conservation concerns is deer overabundance and what it's doing to the native plant life of Pennsylvania, what's doing to the forests of Pennsylvania. It's a huge conservation issue, that top-level predator. That puts us and it puts sportsmen as a top-level predator, which is why DCNR is it really opens up most of our land to hunters to try to create that top-level predation opportunity for. But meanwhile, our coyotes, our coyote population has a segment of wolf DNA in it, and if you follow coyote biology through the Pennsylvania Game Commission, they have jurisdiction over mammals. Our coyotes are increasing in size over the decades. So the wolf and the wolf part of the coyote genetic is emerging, and coyotes are more plentiful and bigger, and taking small deer at this point. Black bears have learned, and are the biggest predator of small deer at this moment. There's the wild's still out there, and nature's making its adjustment, and you'll see that niche closing a little bit over time.
We've got to wrap up, but can we give one last round of applause for Alan and Cindy?